We tell our lives in story form. We live our lives through stories. Now, it's interesting that biblical truths are embodied, are given through stories. We do not have a verse that tells us God is triune. Believe in the God who's one being, but three, namely the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. However, that idea is given to us in a story. Sawa. The idea of God is given to us in stories. Another author by the name J.R.R. Tolkien says this. The Christian, talking about now the Gospels, he says, the Christian myth was not true in the sense of revealing the actual nature of God and how exactly mankind has been redeemed. But he says, the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection compose the best vehicle, the best narrative by which the human mind could be illuminated and catch a glimpse of the deeper structures and the eternity. What he means, Gerald Tolkien, a lot of words, he's saying God was pleased to use the story of the incarnation, that is Jesus coming as man, God became flesh, his death on the cross and his resurrection is the best way for us to understand God and his plan and purposes for our lives. And all of that is given to us in a story. Now you might ask yourself, why am I going ranting about stories? The reason this is true is because Paul himself, especially now in Ephesians chapter 3, he sees himself as part of a great story. One that has not come to an end, but that one he has been commissioned to tell about. He sees himself as part of what God began a long time ago through his ancestors, beginning with people like Akina Abraham, Akina Moses, and up to Jesus Christ. And he sees himself as part of that great story. He's continuing, wrote from eternity past, and is now unfolding after page. And this is how we are going to approach today's topic. This is how we're going to look at this text. We're going to see three things. That is the man, that is Paul. Then we're going to look at the mystery. And finally, we're going to see the manifest. We're going to look at three things: the man, the mystery, and the manifest. So let's begin with the first one, the man. Now, we read from verse 1 to 2, which says, for this reason, I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, on behalf of you Gentiles, assuming that you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me. Verse 7 and 8 says, of this gospel I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given me by the working of his power. To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. Now, in chapters from verse 11 to 22, I'm assuming that's what you covered last week, Paul began this theme of Jews and Gentiles and how God in Christ Jesus finally reconciled them together. We saw that through the death of Jesus, and Paul the temple imagery, because he describes the death of Jesus. He describes his as a veil of stone so that we, the Jews and Gentiles, can become one. All of us together can have access to God. If you think the temple imagery, I'm assuming that's what you covered last week. If you know the temple, the design well, you know that there's the outer space, and then there's the holy place, and then there's the Holy of Holies. So the outer space, and then I would say, of course, now I'm thinking about the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was surrounded with a wall. And if you think about the temple particularly, the temple had a place where there was only where only Gentiles could approach, and they could get past that, for which women could get, and they could get any further than that, Jewish men, and the priests, and then finally the high priests. And so Paul describes the body of Jesus being torn, the veil that was torn, in order that all of us, from the one who's far away, the Gentile who's far away, to the very Jew who's near to the sort of like the door of the temple, all of them have access to God. That is what I'm assuming you covered last week. And so Paul is looking at that whole story and says that he has been captivated by that story. Seeing how God has done such a marvelous work redeeming man, in redeeming the brokenness that was in the world, especially now in light of Jews and Gentiles, in light of men with God. That is a glorious thing that God did. So verse 1, we read that Paul was a prisoner. He says that I am a prisoner of Christ. So the great story of salvation, and particularly how God is uniting all things, has captured Paul's heart, has taken captive of Paul, and the message itself has entered into his heart so deeply that he himself sees himself as a prisoner of Christ. Paul is using this word prisoner to mean two things: that his heart has been captured by the gospel, and that the gospel has caused him to be captured. So he's using it in a two-way sense. Paul is a prisoner of Christ because he totally belongs to Christ. His heart has been captured. His heart has been captivated by this glorious story. And the glorious story is the same story that has caused captured. Not only is Paul a prisoner of this same gospel, he has been made a steward of this same gospel. If you read in verse 2, this is what it says: assuming that you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you. Paul was made a steward of the gospel because his heart was captured, because he is now a prisoner of Jesus Christ. He's now made a steward of the same gospel. He has been made an administrator of this glorious message, which he must faithfully preach to the Gentiles, because that is what a steward must do. A steward is the person who has been given charge over things to take care till the owner of those goods might come back. And so Paul, having been given the charge of the gospel, particularly to the Gentiles, a demand is placed on him to be faithful to it. So Paul has been made a prisoner of Christ, a steward of Christ, and finally, he has been made a minister of Christ. We read this in verse 7 to 9. We read, of this gospel, I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me by the working of his power. To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God, who created all things. So Paul has been made a prisoner. His heart has been captured. He has then been made an administrator, and finally he has been commissioned to minister. God has commissioned Paul to preach this gospel to the Gentiles in particular. And he does not consider himself as a worthy candidate of this great gospel. He sees himself as a humble servant of the Lord, one who was unworthy and yet has been given the grace, who has been empowered, who has been strengthened, who has been equipped for such a glorious task as the one he has. And he's not boasting because of his position. The reason he's telling us all these things is not so that he can boast that I am an apostle, to brag of his own status. No. He's telling us where God has placed him in that great story. That Paul, a prisoner, a steward, and a minister, that is his part in this great story. Realize this story began from eternity past. If you can remember, as we talked about in chapter 1, that this plan of God was from where? From all eternity. From the very foundations of the world. From before the foundations of the world, God had this plan to do what? To make us his own. And so the fullness of this story was realized with Jesus Christ. And Paul sees himself now captivated by that story, commissioned to preach it. And now he's empowered to do so because of God's grace. Notice this, that it is God who captured his heart and then made him a steward and finally commissioned him for the same message. God is the one who begins this good work, strengthens this good work, and sustains this good work. Bonus if you to all those who have been called to serve in the house of the Lord, like Paul, God is the one who calls, God is the one who captures our heart, God is the one who calls us, God is the one who commissions us, God is the one who sustains us, and God is the one who strengthens us. Like Paul, who was called by God, we too, in our own various places, in our own various spaces, God is the one who's going to sustain us by his grace. If you can notice, he says in verse 7, of this gospel I was made a minister according to The gift of what? Of God's grace, which was given to me by the working, not of our own strength, but by the power of God. Ministry is sustained by the Lord. Our faith is sustained by the Lord. And therefore, we can trust that if Paul was made that, he who considers himself the least of all the saints, we can trust that God is doing the same work in our lives. So that's the first one. Let's talk about the mystery. Let's talk about the mystery. So we've looked at the man, that is Paul, the prisoner, the steward, and the minister. Let's talk about the mystery. We read in verse 2 to 5. Now, I have rearranged this text so that I can be able to capture everything that I feel is necessary for us to see. So don't worry how I'm jumping back and forth, yeah? If you follow through, you will see that I've captured every verse. It's just that I've rearranged my verses so that I can capture what I need us to see. We read in verse 2 to 5. Assuming that you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you, how the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I have written briefly. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. Now, Paul tells us two things which are really important to understand about this great mystery. We are going to see what that mystery is, but he's going to tell us two really important things about this mystery. The first one is that it is made known by revelation. The mystery of God is made known by revelation. Right here, as I was entering, we've sang a song that, may God reveal his grace towards us. We're going to see something about that in a few. But first, the mystery is made known to us by revelation. Secondly, this mystery has been revealed. So the first, it's made known by revelation. And secondly, this mystery is no longer a secret. Rather, it has been made now an open thing. So let's talk about the first one. The mystery as revelation. The mystery as a revelation. Now we read in verse 3, how the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I have written briefly. How the mystery was made known to me, Paul speaking of himself, this mystery was made known to him by revelation. Now Paul tells us something fascinating about this mystery. There is no way for us to come to the understanding of this mystery apart from it being revealed. Bwana asifiwe. The word revelation, it's a Greek word for apocalypsis, which we get the word apocalypse, which means the unveiling. It means the removal of a veil so that something can be seen. That's what revelation means. It means the removal of a veil so that something can be seen. Now that's really, really important. You see, brothers and sisters, our Christianity is first and foremost a revelation. You cannot arrive to it in any natural way. You cannot go to school to study. You can study theology, but it's not the same thing as a revelation. It will not capture your heart. Only a revelation can. The gospel that you are preaching is first and foremost a revelation. It has to appear to you in some sense. It has to capture your heart in some sense. You cannot arrive to the Christian truth scientifically. You cannot arrive to the gospel even philosophically. It has to be made known to you by God. God has to remove the veil from your eyes for you to see the glory and the beauty of this gospel. Now that's really important. I am personally a huge fan of apologetics. If you do not know what apologetics is a field where people defend the faith. If you see people who are debating whether with Islam, Muslims, or debating with atheists, what they are doing is called apologetics. Now, I'm a huge fan of that. I love apologetics occasionally. But apologetics, however good it is not the same thing as revelation. It's not the same thing as revelation. And this is really important for us to understand. If you understand that the gospel, first of all, is a revelation, we'll have a heart to pray that God will open the eyes of people. Whether we are going out for evangelism, whether we are going out for missions, whether we are going out to do even that apologetic work, our first heart and burden will be to pray that God will open the eyes. Because if he doesn't, it is a vain things. It is a ramblings. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are what? Who are perishing. To those who are dying, it is foolishness. It looks nonsense. But those who are being saved, it is the power of God unto salvation. To those who have been saved, they have been captured by this revelation. Their eyes have been opened to see this glory. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 from verse 12 to 18. It's a long passage, but let's read. Since you have such a hope, are very bold, not like Moses, who will put a veil on his face so the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts.